She did not hear the whip first. She heard the silence. The kind of silence that falls over a plantation when something terrible is about to happen, when every breath is held like a fragile thread. That was the moment 12-year-old Lydia Moore lifted her charcoal-stained fingers from the plank of discarded pine wood and realized she had been watched. The portrait she had been secretly sketching, an impossibly delicate rendering of her mother's face, was still unfinished, smudged where her thumb had dragged across the cheek. She froze, and in that single breath, her life changed forever. Lydia was born on a cotton plantation outside Natchez, a place where days were measured in labor and nights were measured in fear. The year was 1862, the Civil War tearing apart the country. Yet here, on the edges of the deep South, life for the enslaved seemed unchanged, except for the whispers. Whispers that the Union Army was advancing. Whispers that freedom might be coming. Whispers that some overseers were becoming more violent, fearing everything slipping from their hands. Lydia never cared much for rumors. She cared for lines, shadows, shapes, light. She saw beauty where others only saw survival. A broken cedar trunk became a palette. Crushed berries became pigments. Her fingers, always blackened by soot or charcoal, moved with an instinct far older than her years. Even other enslaved workers glanced at her drawings with quiet awe. But they also warned her, again and again. Child, hide it. Don't let them see you doing that. Because the master didn't like difference. The mistress didn't like talent. And the overseer, Jonas Pike, didn't like anything he couldn't control. But Lydia couldn't stop. Art was her breath. It was the only place she existed fully, where the world bent into colors and lines and truth that no chain could hold. On that afternoon, the sky glowed red from a sinking sun, and for a moment, Lydia forgot where she was. She forgot the plantation. She forgot the danger. Her mother had been sold 2 months earlier, dragged away in the middle of the night while Lydia screamed, clawed, begged. She had no portrait of her, no memory except the blur of her face. So she tried to draw her. Again and again and again. And that was the moment Jonas Pike stepped behind her. He had been doing rounds, ensuring no one had slipped off into the woods. His shadow stretched across the dirt, covering her drawing. Lydia felt her throat close. She turned slowly, praying he hadn't seen, praying her trembling hands would not give her away. But he had already lifted the plank of wood. "What's this?" he muttered, tilting it into the fading light. "You been wasting time?" "No, sir," Lydia whispered. I finished work early." "That's so? And you chose to spend your time scribbling, like some schoolhouse brat." He laughed, but it wasn't humor. It was the cruel sound of a man who enjoyed watching the weak wither. "Who taught you to do this?" "No one, sir." He stared at the portrait, his expression tightening. "Looks like her," he said darkly. Lydia flinched. "You miss your mama?" Her silence was his answer. Jonas Pike snapped the plank in half. The sound was louder than the cicadas, louder than the wind. Lydia felt something inside her break too. Not the talent, not even the hope, but something softer, something that once believed the world might allow beauty, even in small corners. Jonas tossed the broken pieces onto the dirt, then grabbed her forearm. "Master don't need no trouble from you. You keep your eyes down, your hands busy here." "Yes, sir," she whispered. But he didn't let go. He looked at her hands, stained with charcoal. He squeezed harder. These hands better be picking cotton, not drawing. Then he shoved her backward so hard she stumbled onto the ground. He walked away, but the fear stayed. It settled deep in her chest, heavy as iron. That night, as the quarters fell quiet and smoke curled from dying fires, Lydia couldn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling, listening to whispers outside. Men talking about the Union soldiers getting closer, about the master preparing to flee deeper south. In those dark hours, Lydia realized 2 things. Jonas would watch her now, and if she wanted to keep drawing, if she wanted to keep the last piece of her mother, she would have to do it in secret. The next morning, she stole a scrap of charred wood from behind the smokehouse. And she found a new hiding place, a hollow in the abandoned tool shed behind the cotton fields. It was damp, narrow, filled with shadows, but it was hers. It was the only place the world could not reach her hands. Over the next weeks, Lydia drew every stolen moment she could find. Her mother's face, her mother's hands, the memories she feared would fade. She drew until her fingertips were raw. She drew because if she didn't, she felt she would disappear too. And then one day, something unexpected happened. The plantation's mistress, Lydia Moore, discovered one of Lydia's hidden drawings. It happened on a Sunday afternoon when the workers were granted a few hours of rest, something rare and inconsistent. Lydia had stepped out to get water, leaving her latest drawing tucked behind a loose plank in the quarters. She had been working on a portrait of a young white woman, idealized, imagined, based on glimpses of Lydia Moore from a distance. Lydia didn't admire the woman. Lydia was harsh, cold, obsessed with appearances. But her face was interesting, angular, pale, with eyes that never softened. Lydia's fingers had been studying that face like a puzzle. When she returned, she saw Lydia standing in the doorway of the quarters, holding the sketch. Lydia's stomach dropped. No one moved. Everyone froze and stared. Even the air felt suffocating. Lydia studied the drawing silently for a long time. Her expression unreadable. Lydia's lungs refused to work. She knew what Lydia had done to others over far less. Finally, the mistress looked at her. "You drew this." It wasn't a question. Lydia nodded, barely. Lydia's eyes narrowed. "Where did you learn such a thing?" Lydia's voice shook. "Nowhere, ma'am." Lydia stepped closer. "You're lying." She scanned the room, her voice growing sharp. "Which one of you taught her?" No one answered. Lydia's gaze returned to Lydia. "Come with me." It felt like walking toward her own execution. Lydia led her through the main yard, past the columns of the big house, into a small side room Lydia had never entered. Inside were canvases stacked against the wall, brushes laid out on a table, and a half-finished oil painting of the mistress herself. Lydia's breath caught. She had never seen real paints before. The colors shone like jewels. Lydia Moore was a painter. A secret one. She stared at Lydia as if she were studying a curiosity, a strange creature found in the woods. "You have talent," she said flatly. "But talent without discipline is worthless. I need someone to prepare my materials. Mix pigments. Clean brushes. You will do this for me." Lydia blinked in disbelief. "You will continue your field work," Lydia added coldly. "This is not a privilege. It is labor. If you obey, you will not be punished. If you disobey," her voice softened to something far more dangerous, "I will make sure you never draw again." Lydia nodded quickly, but deep inside, her heart flickered. Because for the first time in her life, she was surrounded by real tools. Real colors. Real possibility. She did not know it yet, but this room, this hidden studio, would become the place where her gift would grow into something breathtaking, and where her life would begin to unravel in ways she could never imagine. As Lydia lifted her eyes to the rows of paints she was now forced to touch, she felt a strange shiver run through her, a blend of fear, awe, and something like destiny. She did not yet understand how dangerous this new world was, or how it would soon cost her everything. Lydia learned quickly that Lydia Moore's art studio was not a sanctuary. It was a battlefield made of brushes, pigments, and the relentless sharpness of the mistress's eyes. The room always smelled of linseed oil and drying paint, a scent Lydia grew to associate with both terror and possibility. The first days were the hardest. Lydia expected silence. Absolute silence. Lydia mixed pigments with stone and oil, grinding them into the smooth paste the mistress demanded. Her hands, once stained by charcoal and dirt, were now colored by ochres, blues, and deep siennas. She worked with precision because any mistake meant punishment, not always physical, but sometimes far worse. Lydia had a way of looking at Lydia that made her feel small, like a tool she might discard if it no longer served its purpose. But there were moments, brief, fragile flashes, where the mistress watched Lydia's fingers move with a strange intensity. Not admiration, not kindness, something colder, a recognition that frightened them both. One late afternoon, as the cicadas screamed outside and heat pressed against the shutters, Lydia stepped back from her painting with a frustrated sigh. The portrait she was working on, an image of herself in a white dress, posed beside the piano, wasn't coming together. Her brushstrokes were stiff, the colors too dull. She snapped at Lydia repeatedly, blaming her for things that weren't her fault. The pigments were too dry, the light was wrong, the brushes hadn't been cleaned perfectly. Finally, Lydia threw the brush onto the table. "Why is it so difficult?" she hissed. "She looks lifeless." Lydia hesitated. Speaking was dangerous. But something inside her, The part that understood color and shadow like breathing rose before she could silence it. Because there is too much white in her face, she whispered. Eleanor turned sharply. What did you say? Lydia's heart pounded. If you darken the shadows. Here. She pointed to her own cheek. And here. Eleanor stared. Then, slowly, she handed Lydia the brush. Show me. Lydia froze. The room suddenly felt smaller. She was not allowed to touch the mistress's paintings. But Eleanor did not retract the offer. Her expression was unreadable, her hands perfectly still. After a long, trembling moment, Lydia stepped forward. She held the brush like a living thing. Her fingers shook as she dipped it lightly into the pigment. She hovered near the canvas, waiting for Eleanor to stop her, to scream, to strike. But nothing happened. So Lydia painted. She touched the canvas as gently as one touches a sleeping child. A single soft stroke near the cheekbone. Another beneath the chin. She added warmth to the skin, deepening the shadows until the painted face looked more real, more alive. Eleanor breathed in sharply, not with anger, but something like shock. Lydia stepped back immediately, eyes down, hands clasped behind her. Silence hung between them, heavy and electric. Eleanor finally spoke. Where did you learn to do that? Lydia swallowed hard. I just see it. That night, Lydia expected punishment. She lay awake, listening to the distant frogs and the creak of the quarters. But none came. For days afterward, Eleanor said nothing about the moment. Lydia continued grinding pigments, cleaning brushes, mixing colors. But something had shifted, quietly, dangerously. The mistress now watched her differently. Not like a servant, not like a child, but like something else, something she didn't know how to control. Then came the evening when Union cannon fire thundered faintly in the distance. The war was closing in. The plantation workers murmured the news in shaking whispers. Some prayed. Some dreamed. Some feared the overseers might grow even more violent. Jonas Pike certainly did. He seemed to unravel with every rumor of approaching Union soldiers. He prowled the fields like a restless predator. When he learned Lydia was being taken to the big house more often, his fury simmered. One morning, he grabbed her arm so hard, she felt his fingers for hours afterward. You think going up there makes you special? He growled under his breath. You ain't special. And when all this ends, girl, I'll make sure you remember who you belong to. Lydia didn't respond. Fear was a living thing inside her chest. But she also felt something else, a flicker of defiance she couldn't quite extinguish. She clung to that flicker as she returned to the studio. One afternoon, while Eleanor was busy with a guest in the parlor, Lydia found herself alone in the studio for the first time. The late light streamed through the window, illuminating the stack of unused canvases against the wall. She knew she shouldn't. If anyone caught her, she would suffer consequences she could not imagine. But her fingers moved on their own. She reached for a tiny scrap of canvas, something barely larger than her hand, and a small brush. She mixed colors with quiet urgency, her breath catching in her throat. She painted fast but carefully, letting instinct guide her. Line by line, shadow by shadow, a face emerged. Not Eleanor's. Not her mother's. Her own. It was the first time she had ever tried to paint herself. She didn't know why she did it. Maybe she needed proof that she existed. That she was more than labor. More than fear. More than silence. The portrait was unfinished when the door swung open. Eleanor stood in the doorway. Lydia's heart stopped. The brush slipped from her fingers. Cold dread washed over her as she stepped back from the canvas. Eleanor did not move. She did not shout. Her eyes drifted slowly to the small portrait. She walked toward it with a kind of haunted fascination. You painted this, she said quietly. Lydia's voice barely came out. I'm sorry, ma'am. I shouldn't have. It's extraordinary. Lydia blinked. Eleanor lifted the scrap of canvas gently, as though it were fragile glass. She studied it, her pale fingers trembling ever so slightly. You captured emotion, the mistress whispered, almost to herself. Depth. Something I have never been able to paint. How does a child like you know these things? Lydia said nothing. Eleanor looked at her with an intensity that felt both dangerous and intimate. You could be useful to me, she murmured. More useful than I realized. She set the portrait down carefully. Then her tone changed, soft, cold, deliberate. But if anyone finds out you can paint like this, they will destroy you. Do you understand that? Lydia nodded quickly, fear slicing through her. Eleanor stepped closer, lowering her voice. You will paint for me. Only for me. No one else is to know. Her eyes hardened to steel. If Jonas Pike learns of this, your life will end in ways I cannot even protect you from. The room felt smaller. Darker. The shadows deepened as if listening. Eleanor leaned in. Do you understand, Lydia? Yes, ma'am, Lydia whispered. Good. Eleanor straightened. Tomorrow, we begin something new. Something ambitious. She glanced at the window, where smoke from distant gunfire drifted faintly across the sky. And we must finish it before the Union Army arrives. Lydia's breath caught. Finish what? Eleanor looked back at her. A masterpiece, she said softly. Then she walked out, leaving Lydia alone, shedding a trembling breath, staring at the small painted face she'd created, knowing that whatever was coming next would change everything. Forever. The world around the plantation was unraveling long before anyone admitted it. Smoke rose from distant clashes. The faint rumble of cannon fire rolled through the humid evenings like distant thunder. Rumors said Union soldiers were pushing closer to Natchez. Farmers hid valuables. Slave catchers grew restless. Overseers drank more heavily, snapping at shadows that weren't there. Inside the small studio room, Eleanor Moore worked with a frantic energy Lydia had never seen before. The mistress no longer painted alone. She demanded Lydia stand beside her, guiding her through each stroke, each color shift, each delicate change in light. It was intoxicating and terrifying, Eleanor's world closing in around them like a tightening circle. They were painting a portrait, one unlike anything Lydia had touched before. It was of Eleanor herself, but not as she was. Younger, softer, a version of her painted in warm light, wearing a gown she no longer fit into, standing in the midst of flowers that didn't grow anywhere on the plantation. Eleanor said the painting would preserve her beauty before the war devoured everything. But Lydia sensed something deeper, something desperate. Sometimes, when Eleanor thought Lydia wasn't looking, she touched the canvas with a trembling hand, as though she were reaching out to a ghost. Days blurred into one another. Lydia painted whenever Eleanor let her. Sometimes hours passed without a word spoken between them. Sometimes Eleanor whispered memories, fragments of her youth, her loneliness, her fears that the war would leave her with nothing. One rainy evening, as the mistress stepped back to examine the near-complete portrait, she spoke with a strange softness. You have talent that should not exist, she murmured. Not here. Not in you. Lydia didn't know how to answer. You could have been a prodigy in the North, Eleanor continued. People would have paid fortunes to study your work. But fate puts brilliance in the one place it can never bloom. She said it like a lament, like a confession. Then her expression darkened. If the soldiers arrive, they will take inventory of the house. They will look through every room. They will ask questions. Do you understand what that means? Lydia felt fear coil in her chest. It means they might discover the truth, Eleanor whispered. That a slave child painted the finest strokes on this canvas. And do you know what will happen then? Lydia shook her head. Eleanor sighed, stepping closer. They will take you, claim you, use you. Your gift will not be yours. It will belong to men who see you as nothing but property. Lydia swallowed her breath. What should I do? Eleanor looked at her with an expression Lydia had never seen. Something like pity, something like envy, something like love twisted into something sharp. We finished the portrait, Eleanor said. And then, I will decide. The days that followed were quiet. Too quiet. Even Jonas Pike seemed to sense something shifting. He lingered near the studio more than usual, pacing, muttering, glaring whenever Lydia passed him. One evening, he tried to follow her inside, but Eleanor blocked the doorway with a cold, steady glare. This room is not for you, she said. Jonas clenched his jaw, his eyes burning with humiliation. Ma'am, with respect. With respect, Eleanor cut in. I do not require your presence when I am working. For a moment, Jonas looked at Lydia with a hatred so deep it chilled her blood. Then he spat on the ground and walked away. That night, Lydia did not sleep. The next morning, the sky was gray and heavy. Thunder rolled in the distance, but it wasn't thunder. Not this time. The Union Army was approaching. By noon, everyone heard it. Hooves, shouts, the metallic echo of bayonets clattering. Fear spread through the plantation like wildfire. Some enslaved people hid. Others prayed. A few dared to hope. Eleanor locked the studio door. She and Lydia stood before the nearly finished portrait, the masterpiece the mistress had spoken of. It glowed even in the dim light, vibrant and haunting, a version of Eleanor that belonged to another world entirely. "It must be finished," Eleanor whispered, voice shaking. "Before they find us." Lydia dipped her brush, her hands trembling. She added the final touches, the glint of light on the eyes, the subtle shadow beneath the jaw, the softness of painted lips that looked almost alive. Outside, chaos grew louder. Jonas Pike barked orders. Horses snorted. Soldiers shouted commands. Eleanor watched Lydia paint as though the world outside no longer existed. When the last stroke was done, Lydia stepped back, breathless. The portrait was breathtaking, alive, shimmering with emotion. Eleanor's eyes filled, not with tears, but with something rawer. "This is me," she whispered. "The way I wish I had been." Then the door rattled. "Open up," a man shouted from outside. "Union Patrol." Eleanor's face drained of color. She grabbed Lydia's wrist. "Hide." Lydia hid behind the stack of canvases, heart pounding so loudly she feared the soldiers would hear it through the walls. The door burst open. 5 Union soldiers stepped inside, rifles in hand. "Ma'am," one said stiffly, "we're searching every structure." "Orders." Eleanor forced a composed smile. "Of course." The soldiers scanned the room. One paused before the portrait. "This yours?" he asked. "Yes," Eleanor replied calmly. "It's impressive." Eleanor kept her breath steady. "Thank you." Another soldier eyed the discarded brushes, the pigments, the multiple styles of strokes. "Seems like more than one hand at work." Eleanor didn't blink. "I study many painters. That's all." The soldier shrugged and turned away. Then, from outside, a scream erupted. "Jonas Pike! Check outside," a soldier barked. "There's a man resisting arrest." The troops rushed out, leaving Eleanor trembling in the sudden silence. Lydia crawled out from behind the canvases, shaken to her core. Eleanor stared at her, breath rapid. "You see? They would have taken you. They would have forced you to paint for them, as a curiosity, a prized oddity." "But I could have been free," Lydia whispered. "Free?" Eleanor looked at her with something close to fury. "Freedom does not exist for people like you or me. Only different kinds of cages." Lydia stepped back, confused and frightened. Eleanor moved toward the portrait, her fingers grazing its edge. "This is my legacy. And yours." Her voice cracked. "But they cannot know you helped create it." She lifted the painting, Lydia's greatest work, and, to Lydia's horror, carried it toward the fireplace. "No," Lydia gasped. Eleanor hesitated at the hearth, tears at last filling her eyes. "It is better to lose beauty than to let someone else claim it." The flames flickered, hungry. Lydia reached for her, but a sudden explosion outside shook the walls. Both women froze. Smoke drifted past the window. Soldiers shouted. Horses bolted. Someone fired a gun. The chaos swallowed the moment. Eleanor turned to Lydia, breathing hard. "We run. Now." Before Lydia could speak, Jonas Pike stormed into the doorway, blood on his temple, rage twisting his face. "You," he snarled at Lydia. "You think you can hide in here with her?" He grabbed Lydia's arm. Eleanor screamed, lunging forward. "Let her go." But Jonas shoved her aside. Eleanor struck the edge of a table and collapsed with a cry. Lydia struggled, terrified, but Jonas dragged her toward the door. Outside, Union soldiers were storming the property. A single gunshot cracked. Jonas stiffened. He fell to the ground. Behind him stood a Union officer, lowering his smoking pistol. Lydia stared, trembling. The officer stepped forward, offering his hand. "You're safe now, miss. You're free." Lydia didn't move. Couldn't move. Eleanor lay on the floor, bleeding, trying to push herself up. Her eyes met Lydia's, full of something Lydia had never seen before. Pride, regret, and an ache that would live in Lydia's heart forever. The officer touched Lydia's shoulder gently. "Come on. Let's get you out of here." Lydia looked at Eleanor one last time. The studio, the paints, the unfinished fire, the portrait that almost became a masterpiece. The woman who had feared her, used her, needed her. Then she stepped outside into the rain, into a world she had never known. Freedom felt heavy, cold, vast. She did not know where she would go or who she would become. But she knew one thing. She would paint. She would paint everything. The sorrow, the beauty, the memories, the truths no one dared speak. Her mother's face. Her own. Eleanor's. Jonas's. The fire. The war. The moment the world cracked open and she stepped into herself. Because stories erased by history deserve to be told again. And her hands, once forbidden to create, would carve her name into a world that once tried to silence her.